Come with me, friends, as I try to gain a better understanding of encryption. Hi, I'm Ken Ray, welcoming you to episode 187 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. A couple of weeks ago, U.S. Attorney General William Barr started saying again that companies like Apple and, well, he was talking specifically about Apple. He was saying that Apple can make it easier for the FBI and the Department of Justice to get into a locked iPhone without weakening protections for consumers. And my hackles were up, and I became indignant because I knew that AG Barr, that what he was saying just was not true. But how did I know that? There are things I hold true about encryption without really knowing why I hold those things true. Wanting to know more, we reached out this week to Patrick Wardle. Had a fascinating conversation with him that I will bring to you in just a moment. Really quickly, though, before that, I want to remind you about the great deal Secure Mac is offering listeners to this show for MacScan 3. I don't do anything really risky with my machine, but I like that MacScan 3 is there for me. MacScan 3 detects and removes Mac malware, catches keyloggers, removes tracking cookies, and provides full range or targeted scanning, all without crowding up my hard drive or slowing down my machine. I've got MacScan 3 set to run every night while I work. Scans my Mac, almost always finds tracking cookies, gets rid of them, all without slowing down what I'm doing and all without me having to think about it. So here is what I would like for you to do. Give MacScan 3 a try. Sign up for a free 30-day trial today at securemac.com/MacScan. Then, once you decide to buy it for less. You can take a little off your subscription to MacScan 3 with offer code CHECKLIST. Try it first, watch it kick those tracking cookies to the curb. Then when you're ready to buy for less with offer code CHECKLIST at securemac.com/MacScan. Patrick Wardle once worked for the NSA. He's currently an Apple security researcher for the enterprise device management firm Jamf. On his own, he runs a Mac security website called Objective-C.com. That's Objective-SEE, Objective-C.com. As I said at the top of the show, I've had questions about encryption over the past few weeks. I consider myself very lucky to be able to ask Patrick Wardle those questions, and I'm very happy to bring our conversation to you. So here's my thing. I believe the DOJ is wrong when it says it knows that there's a way for Silicon Valley to both protect consumer privacy and make it easy for law enforcement to get into a smartphone or other encrypted device when they need to. The problem that I have, though, and I thought about this a week or two ago when William Barr started making a lot more noise than he had been, lately anyway. I believe that because people I trust have told me that. So today I'm going to ask you to teach me and anybody listening why the DOJ is incorrect, assuming that it is. So I do have a few questions that I think I know enough to ask, and we'll see what other questions come out of that. If we could, I wanted to start with the thing that we think about most. If we could start with our phones. What on an out-of-the-box iPhone is encrypted?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And Apple actually has done a tremendous job ensuring that essentially the majority of information on an either out-of-the-box iPhone is encrypted when you go through and set it up. And that's because they really understood that there's a ton of very sensitive, private, personal information on your phone. I mean, think about it. It's your chats, your photos, your location as you carry it around. So if that falls into the wrong hands, or if that information is able to be retrieved, say, for example, by law enforcement, there's some real privacy concerns. So what Apple has done is really designed a very secure consumer device that has a lot of encrypted components. So the first thing is when you set up your phone and you create a passcode, what that does is that largely encrypts essentially all of the information on the phone. So that includes the majority of the file system, user content, et cetera, et cetera. So this means that if say law enforcement gets access to your phone, all that underlying information is fully encrypted very strongly based off your passcode and, of course, some other encryption keys as well. So kind of the short answer to that question is basically everything. And again, that's designed specifically by Apple to protect the privacy of their users.
See, so it's when you're answering that question that I realize how little I know, because I think of my passcode as like a lock in a way, right? So if I can't open that lock, I can't get into the information, but I don't think of the information inside it as being encrypted. I just think, well, it's in there. It's sort of like Schrodinger's cat, I guess, in a way. I mean,
in a way, and it does act as both in the sense it's definitely kind of predominantly a lock, right? You got to put in that passcode just like you need a key to open the door. But behind the scenes, as you're inserting that key and turning the lock, if that key is correct, if your passcode is correct, that is also decrypting the information. So it's a very kind of efficient approach to killing two birds with one stone. That's kind of locking your phone, but then also allowing an encryption key that is derived off something that the user specifically created. And this we'll probably get into more, but this is one of the reasons why Apple themselves cannot easily or at all decrypt your information, because it's actually encrypted with your specific key that Apple doesn't know about. And they did that by design. So if and when law enforcement comes to them and says, can you decrypt this phone? They say, we technically actually can't because we've designed it in a way that the encryption key that protects everything is based on information that the user creates and only that specific user knows.
See, that blows my mind because I'm sorry. I'm completely stunned because that changes everything that I thought. I mean, well, we started by me saying I know I don't know anything, but I mean that completely like challenges everything that I thought I knew, because I assume that like the email that I wrote to my mom yesterday, is still in my phone in email form, whether I have put in my passcode or not. But what you're saying is, as soon as I turn it off, all that stuff is encrypted, or is it always encrypted and it's just putting in my passcode that decrypts it? Sure.
So we can think about it this way. When your phone is off, essentially everything is encrypted. So your emails, your photos, et cetera, et cetera. So if someone tries to access your phone and say they have a way to access the hard drive, the actual bits on that's all encrypted. So it basically gives an attacker nothing. If they power on the phone, it's going to get to the prompt where it's going to ask for your passcode. When you enter that, that's going to fully decrypt the majority of the user, your specific content. So if there is a email that's sitting on your iPhone, and it's important to differentiate the email on the copy that's on your iPhone versus on Google server versus the copy that goes across the network, because those are all different transmission mediums that are encrypted in different ways. But when it's physically sitting on your phone, it is going to be encrypted when the phone is off and remain encrypted until you enter in your passcode. And so that's why a lot of the times when you hear law enforcement, what they're trying to do is they're trying to gain access to the unlock passcode, because with that will decrypt the content that's physically sitting on the iPhone or iOS device.
Okay. Is there a way to explain to me simply how the encryption part of it actually works? I mean, which is to say, exactly what I'm asking. Like 1, 2, 3, 4 is my passcode. And of course it isn't, but let's say it is. 1, 2, 3, 4 is my passcode. So I put that in. And at that point, what happens is I consider my phone to be unlocked. What's actually happening in the background, this stuff is being decrypted, or when I close it, it's being encrypted. I mean, is that... I feel like we're almost talking about like some sort of mathematical state where things exist constantly in an encrypted and unencrypted state, and it's just depending on how I look at it, which may sound crazy, but this whole thing sounds crazy to me now, where it didn't 5 minutes before we started talking, I swear, Patrick.
So an analogy that kind of just came to me is, imagine you're checking into a hotel room. So you go to the front desk, you check in, and they give you a key that's unique to you that's been kind of rekeyed just as you checked in. So that is kind of like your password, 123. When you get to the room, you swipe your badge, and that opens the door, unlocks it. But at the same time, it might turn on the power and turn on the TV. The lights come on, the AC comes on, et cetera, et cetera. So that one key has two purposes, right? It lets you in physically, but then also takes some action to prepare the room for your entry. So your passcode on the phone can be thought of that somewhat similarly. There's an analogy here. So yes, it provides kind of access to your apps, like you unlock it, you can now use the phone. But in the background, what it's doing, it's taking those specific numbers, and as you mentioned, there's some mathematical construct, but it's basically taking those numbers and opening up other pieces of information, decrypting. So decrypting is basically, again, we're taking some liberties in this discussion. It's kind of just like unwrapping something. So, you need a key, you need the correct fingerprint, you need the correct certain numbers to kind of open the package. But once you do that, that information is available. So again, that passcode for your phone, dual purposes, lets you in, allows you to use the phone, but in the background, it's also opening up all the information that has been encrypted so that apps, for example, your email app, can now read and use the content, which is now transparently decrypted behind the scenes based on your user passcode. So that's why it's very important to have a good user passcode and not just use 123.
Okay, so I am still struggling for a good analogy, and I feel like I may have hit on one. I don't know, but tell me if this actually explains it in a way that helps my brain. And you can't explain my brain, I understand that. But it's almost like my phone and I speak a language that only my phone and I can speak. And the passcode is the translator. So the information exists constantly, but I don't understand the information unless I turn the translator on between the two of us.
Exactly. And the key to all of this, no pun intended, is the key, right? So by the way you turn on the translator or kind of make and translate the encrypted data to plain text is your user passcode. It's your user key. And again, that's done by design. So Apple has plausible deniability. When law enforcement shows up with a locked phone and says, unlock this, they say, we can't, we don't know the key.
Right. And then if you are somebody who does use 1, 2, 3, 4, or who uses the same password for everything, you become the weak link in the encryption process. I mean, that's why the guys at Secure Mac,
exactly.
and I assume you and everybody else says, strong passwords and unique passwords for everything you do.
100%. Yeah. And that's why also Apple has built in some mitigations. For example, if you try using 1, 2, 3, they'll yell at you when you're setting up your phone. And also they do things like, even if you're using Face ID or Touch ID, if the phone is rebooted, you have to put in that passcode. Because in theory, a lot of the biometrics are easier to break than a passcode, right? You could lift someone's fingerprint perhaps off, a cup they were drinking or something, whereas the passcode is essentially exists only in their mind, which is safe for now.
So in the same way that 1, 2, 3, 4 is not nearly as good as, horse battery? I can't remember, but the XKCD thing. In the same way that 1, 2, 3, 4 is not as good as, and I'm making stuff up, like 1 through 16, let's say. I mean, that's stronger. It's ridiculous. It's stupid, but it's stronger. In the same way that a less complex password is not as good as a more complex password, there are levels of encryption, yes?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there are generally key lengths traditionally, and this all comes kind of back to brute forcing. So the idea of brute forcing is, imagine someone has gained physical access to your phone, it's locked, they need to access your data, and so as we discussed, the way to kind of turn on that translator or unlock it is to have the correct passcode. If you don't have it, well, you might start guessing and try 0000, 0001, 0002, et cetera, all the way up to 99999. So that's kind of like a manual brute force attempt. So the idea is if you have a longer passcode and under the hood a longer encryption key, which is often derived from your short passcode in a mathematically secure way, it just prevents or resists rather brute force attacks better. Because assuming the encryption algorithm is secure, and the ones that Apple use are, by all definitions of our current understanding of mathematics and cryptography. The only way to then decrypt the data if you don't have that passkey is basically to guess it. And that's, again, a brute force attack. So the shorter the key, and again, encryption algorithms have different key lengths, right? And you might have one that's 128 bits, 256, 512. Obviously, longer just means there are more variations to have to guess. So it's kind of the same idea. There's parallels between choosing a passcode that's longer and having, special characters, numbers, uppercase, lowercases, and kind of the length of the encryption key. They're both, more complex is better, and that's because it's more difficult to guess. So that's kind of the idea of various levels of encryption. It's usually based on the length of the key. Longer keys are, like longer passwords, harder to guess.
And then before we move off our phones and back to our friends at the DOJ, the same thing's happening on the other end. So if we go back to what I said earlier, where, I wrote an email to my mom yesterday. I didn't send it yet, but it's living on my phone as an encrypted thing until I put in my passcode. That decrypts it for me. Then I send it to her. Yep. She's got a passcode on her phone as well. So when it arrives on her phone, it now arrives as encrypted, something that would be not identifiable to anybody until she puts in her passcode, which is hopefully better than 4321, and is able to basically get that translation or that decrypted message. Yeah, correct. Again, it's important to understand that when that email kind of arrives to her, it's going to be, kind of comes over the wire, over the network. Mm-hmm. Those bits, those bytes are encrypted in a different way, right? That's, SSL level security. That's network level security. Once it's on her phone, though, when she's downloaded it to her phone, when she, shuts off her phone or locks it, you are correct. That information is then locked on her phone using her specific encryption key and passcode. So yeah, it's a good point because, you have to be careful where you're sending the information to. One, because there is the network layer, which can perhaps be attacked in different ways if that encryption is not very secure. And two, the recipient, if they don't use a passcode or have a very weak one, now that becomes perhaps the weaker link. And the network level is actually generally where most attackers now try to play because it's often more difficult to secure things at the network level than on a physical device. And one great example is, text messages and cell phone traffic. That's encrypted, but not very strongly. So, two people can be having a discussion on cell phones, and if they're using kind of the traditional cell phone phone network, there are various attacks against that protocol. So again, that's kind of an example of a network level attack that can perhaps recover plain text that's occurring between two devices at the network level. I'm not gonna make you say that you'll be back on sometime, but I would love to have that discussion at some point as well. Just because, the things that we can do things about. Obviously you use a service that you consider to be safe. The things that mostly we can do though is having complex passcodes on our phones, or making sure we even have passcodes on our phones, things like that. I guess that's why I'm sort of concentrating on this today. But I would love to talk about. Yep. All the waypoints between when I hit send and when somebody else, opens my email at some point. Exactly. I do want to go back to our friends at the DOJ, though. And I'm not trying to be a wise guy when I say that. It's just the kind of way I say it. So when the DOJ or when local law enforcement or various politicians say, they know that if Silicon Valley really put its mind to it, they could make it possible to access information without weakening encryption. That doesn't sound right.
So here's the funny thing about that. The DOJ doesn't believe that. Anybody you talk to that has a technical understanding of what encryption, and there may be some politicians that just don't wrap their head around encryption, and that's fine. They're not necessarily have to be experts. But, people at the FBI, people at the DOJ, I'm sure Mr. Barr, I believe his name, knows that is an untrue statement. And I'm not saying he's lying. I'm just saying we have to understand and look why they're saying that. And it's funny because people get all spun up, and I think they're kind of really not focusing on what is really going on. So we have politicians saying Silicon Valley should be able to create a device that's also protects the user, but sometimes law enforcement can show up. Anybody who understands cryptography technology knows that's just an absurd claim. And people get all upset that politicians are saying this, but the politicians know what they're asking for is absurd, incorrect, and likely impossible. Mm-hmm. But what it does is it provides a few things. First, it gives the politicians plausible deniability. So when there's a mass shooting or a terrorist attack and they are not unable to lock that phone, they can say, hey, look, we knew this was going to happen because encryption by definition protects devices. There's this device we can't break into because the encryption is working. We told you guys in the past that if this happened, we weren't going to break into this. So it's really not our fault. It's your fault. So it's the DOJ preemptively making statements so that if and when something bad happens, they have something to point back to and say, yeah, this is the problem we knew we were going to run into. We tried to do something about it, but Silicon Valley and Apple didn't want to work with us. Even though they know there's no solution, it really helps them shift the blame. And this is exactly what they're doing. I don't think they really believe that there is a secure way to create an encrypted device that has some backdoor. I mean, you see state secrets leaked from the FBI, the NSA gets their exploits stolen. Everyone knows it's basically very difficult to secure, if you were having backdoor encryption keys and all that. Invariably, that would leak. Hackers would find that, and it would undermine the whole system. So what I really believe is the DOJ is doing is they're just trying to pre-position themselves and make these claims so that they can basically pass the buck, or if something, as I mentioned, something bad happens and they can't decrypt the device, they can really point at Apple or these other companies and kind of blame them. So that's interesting. That's kind of my take on it. I mean, I'm sure they would also love if Apple did give them a way to decrypt phones, but I don't think they believe that's going to happen. Apple has really built its entire company around the idea of user security. If they had a way for governments to unlock devices, it would completely undermine that. So Apple would die on that hill defending that. And we've seen them basically do that. The FBI shows up the phone, say, hey, we need to lock this. Apple basically says, sorry, we can't help you. And again, that's by design. So Apple has taken a very smart approach where they developed a system where from a technical point of view, they essentially can't help even if they wanted to. And the good thing is they don't want to, which, helps sell a lot of phones, helps protect their users. But at the same time, also gives Apple plausible deniability because, it's like, guys, even if we wanted to help you, we couldn't. So Apple did a very smart approach. And I believe other phone developers, companies probably took a similar approach. I'm just more familiar with iOS. So, we're going to see DOJ continue to do this. I mean, since governments have been created, they've been complaining about encryption. It obviously makes the job harder. But at the same time, it does benefit governments. And this is kind of interesting. And this is somewhat tangential, but it does play into encryption and phones. So if I send you a text message via iMessage, that's encrypted by Apple's encryption technology. And it's end-to-end encrypted, meaning only your phone and my phone can see that. So Apple can't even read that. So governments will complain about that and say, oh, we want to be able to read those text messages, those iMessages. We can't. And Apple's like, well, sorry, we can't either. It's only between Patrick and Ken. Well, what an attacker, perhaps even a government attacker, can do is if they have a vulnerability or an iMessage exploit, they can send you a malicious message that can perhaps infect your phone and gain access to all your content, because when your phone's unlocked processing iMessages, that content is unencrypted. And since the iMessage itself is encrypted, Apple nor anybody else can actually see that. So in a way, it can actually be abused by the same government that's complaining about it to deliver exploits that won't be detected. So it's interesting that you have this dual sword that in one hand, the government's complaining about the encryption, but on the other hand, it does benefit them in their offensive hacking capabilities. So it's just kind of an interesting aside as well. But again, just to tie everything back to the DOJ claims, I don't believe for a minute that they actually expect Silicon Valley to create this magical, non-existing, secure backdoor scheme. But I think they're just doing that so, they can point and say, hey, we tried to do this, and if something bad happens, they can say, well, can't blame us. So that's my opinion on the matter.
Well, there is an interesting thing that you say too when you talk about passing the buck. I remember there was somebody, and I can't remember exactly who it is, so I'm not going to say who I think it was. I believe I know, but I don't remember. But basically, somebody came out and said, so what we want Apple to do is to weaken the encryption and make it so that when we come calling, they can get in. But we don't want to hold the key. We want Apple to hold the key, which is fascinating because, I assume you would agree with the statement. The second there is a back door, whoever holds the key to that back door becomes a target for every, everything from just like a wise guy hacker to actual ne'er-do-wells. They've got a target on them at that point. Okay. So then when the DOJ says, no, we don't want the key. We want you to have the key, but we want everybody to know that there is a key so that they know that we can get it. Man, that's Apple, Google, whoever at that point is just... that's you have to wrap yourself in Teflon, or not Teflon. What's the thing that really keeps you safe? I don't know, like bulletproof everything, which you would argue, yeah, right, exactly. Which you would argue that they've already done by having a box that even they can't get into.
Yeah, and if you talk to any cryptographer, the complexity, generally the most complex component of a usable cryptographic system is the key management. That's always kind of like the pain in the ass, for lack of a more mathematically correct term. So I think also that's, again, DOJ passing the buck saying, yeah, we don't want to manage these millions of keys or this one master key because, yeah, if we get hacked and that key gets leaked, we look bad. So Apple, no, you got to manage that. And of course, it's not something Apple wants to take on just from, as you mentioned, puts a big target on their back. But also it would be likely very complicated to implement a system that's both secure and extensible. And again, just right for your attack. Like, okay, some Apple employee now has access to that. Chinese government shows up with, let's say, $1 billion and says, we will give you $1 billion. You just need to give us a copy of that key. Like, eventually someone will take some amount of money and gain access to that key. So again, I think once you start looking at a scheme like this is why I really don't believe the DOJ actually believes it's feasible. But again, they have to make noise and try and it's kind of their job, and I think protects them against future stuff. But like you said, the more you look at a scheme and any scheme that's proposed, cryptographers, engineers, everyone just like tears it to shreds because it's kind of like goes against the entire idea of encryption. So it's like you can't have your cake and eat it too. And this is a perfect example of that.
There is, and this is something I want to say every now and then when I have this conversation with people. I don't think everybody at the DOJ is a bad guy. I don't think the DOJ is necessarily a bad organization. I think we, as a people, and this is true, I would imagine, in just about every country, or at least every country with, I would imagine it's true in every country. We want people to keep us safe. We have authorities that are there ostensibly to keep us safe, and we want people to keep us safe. And so when the DOJ says we need this, I know that I've gotten email from people who have listened to, various shows that I've done for years who say the DOJ needs this because we want people to keep us safe. And there are people who say we're trying to keep you safe. I don't know that I hate to ascribe, bad intent to people who are ostensibly the good guys. Yeah. So I'm willing to say, okay, at least some of them have to not quite understand what it is they're asking for. Like, 70-something-year-old senator from some state, someplace says, well, there ought to be a way to do this. Well, that person has seen us go from, jets that could seat maybe 100 people to super jets that can fly across the ocean in 6 hours. I mean, they've seen a lot happen that they don't understand. And so they may think, well, there's got to be a way. It's just at some point you have to sort of accept the possibility that, no, there's not. Now, I have to ask you one question, though, because now having said, well, there's just no way, how does your science fiction head work? Like if I throw in things like supercomputers, AI, quantum computing, things like that, does that change, pardon my use of the term, does that change the equation at all? Or is that, well, when Buck Rogers calls, then I'm willing to look at it again. But in the meantime, the answer is still what the answer was.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question, too. I'm going to briefly just touch on kind of what you mentioned about, government agendas, keeping people safe. And I think I can definitely speak to this because I actually used to work at the NSA. And the NSA is basically tasked with gathering intelligence about foreign adversaries. And, sometimes we work with the FBI, kind of has a similar job, but for, American citizens. So you can definitely understand both sides of the argument where it's like, the government wants to be able to do its job to protect its citizens. And you can imagine, a terrorist running around in the country having an encrypted phone. That encryption does prevent or may prevent or at least provide a challenge for law enforcement to access that and, maybe prevent an attack against its citizens. So there's definitely two sides of the argument. And like you said, you want the government to be able to do its job to protect its citizens, but at the same time, provide the ways for citizens to not have to fear the government and to be able to, secure their data in a secure and private manner. So again, that's a very large, complex debate, but I think it's important that you did bring that up because, briefly we can go back to DOJ. That's kind of one of their claims where they're saying, hey, look, we don't care about the average American's text messages or photos on their phone. We just want to be able to do our job and make sure people, are secure. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like you said, a lot of good people work in these government organizations. And I think there's always just going to be a balance. And balancing user privacy and government insights is just, and always will be a very complex debate. To get back to your question about kind of future technology, science fiction, and stuff like that, supercomputers kind of are one way that encryption has been attacked, and it goes back to this brute forcing we talked about earlier, where they can basically just try a large number of passcodes simultaneously and ultimately kind of decrypt that. Apple has done a really good job, though, because they bake in this idea of like a number of max tries. So if you try to, for example, decrypt the phone and you get 10 attempts, the phone locks itself and basically says, hey, look, this is a brute force attempt. And there's some ways to kind of get around that, but the way encryption algorithms and key lengths have grown, the complexity of breaking those systems is exponential. So, even the fastest supercomputer in the world, can't crack, the most secure encryption algorithms, which is good. Quantum computing is interesting, though, because certain encryption algorithms, for example, ones that use factoring or the complexity of factoring to protect the information or, leverage prime numbers. There's been a lot of talk and theory that quantum computing can perhaps break some of these concepts or these foundational ideas that protect systems and information. So the idea is there's these mathematical problems, factoring prime numbers is one, that are hard or time consuming to do. And if quantum computing can kind of swoop in and make those trivial problems, now systems that are protected by those systems, by those assumptions, factoring being hard is one of them, will potentially be broken. So that'd be interesting to see. I mean, people have been talking about quantum computing and its impact to cryptography for 10 plus years now. I don't think that there'll be a breakthrough overnight that will change everything. So I think as the technology matures and the capabilities of quantum computing increase, I think the quantum, let's say, resistant cryptography will grow kind of in parallel. And that may not be the case, but that's likely the case. So it's unlikely that tomorrow the FBI will wake up and have a quantum computer that can somehow magically, unlock any iPhone. It's just unlikely to do that. So to kind of take a step back from all of that, it's interesting because there's actually a simpler solution to all of this, and that is exploits and vulnerabilities. So there are lots of hackers, security researchers, and even companies that are developing offensive capabilities that can unlock and or perhaps bypass some of Apple's security mitigations. And this is exactly what the government uses and leverages when they want to try to break into a phone. So I believe it was the FBI and I don't know if it was a terrorist or a mass shooter a few years ago had a locked phone. Apple said, hey, we're not going to unlock this for you. FBI just turned around, bought a capability from a hacker or some security company and used that to unlock the phone. So the unfortunate reality is an iPhone is just a computer, and any computing system is going to have flaws and vulnerabilities. And so there are ways that those can be leveraged by law enforcement to gain access to phones. And so, while quantum computing, supercomputers may pose a threat in the future, I think there's more an immediate threat, which is the existence of vulnerabilities and exploits. So the takeaway from that is it's very important for users to always run the most recent version of iOS, because Apple a lot of times will patch some of these flaws and these vulnerabilities. So if you have the latest version, you are protected. Similar vein too, there's actually vulnerabilities or flaws at the hardware level that can be exploited that the newer models of the iPhones prevent against. So if you're actually very concerned about your privacy and your security of your iPhone, it's best to run the latest software. And then if you can, understanding this is expensive, always try to run the latest hardware version, because again, it has a lot of built-in security mechanisms that can prevent these attacks.
I love a conversation that can both include quantum computing, supercomputing, and why I should use a passcode better than 1, 2, 3, 4.
The whole gamut.
Yeah, exactly. I honestly, I can't thank you enough. I mean, you answered a bunch of questions I had and raised a lot more. And again, I'm not going to make you promise right now, but I really hope that we can get you back on again. Patrick Wardle, thank you very much for spending time with me today.
Yeah, Ken, it's been a pleasure chatting. And I do want to just give a shout out to Secure Mac. They sponsor my Mac security tools and research as well that I do for Objective-C. So really good friend with Mr. Raba, with Nick, and those guys as well. So really appreciate their support.
You can keep up with Patrick a few ways. Follow him on Twitter at Patrick Wardle. That's Wardle at Patrick Wardle if you want to follow him on Twitter. Now, I mentioned earlier that he's got a website, Objective-C.com. He blogs a lot there about Mac security and also has a lot of Mac security tools, free and largely open source for both end users and security people. You can check that out at Objective-C.com. And thanks again to Patrick Wardle for joining us today. Of course, if you're looking for even more security news and how-tos, the place to look is securemac.com/checklist. There you'll find notes for this show and for every show that we've done right up to this one. And you can also listen to every show right there as well. It all starts in one place, securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you would like to ask or a topic you would like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. The address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.